Obviously, Daphne Trimble has joined us today, who was the mentor and advisor to David Trimble. And as she, I think, said on many occasions, where maybe some on the national side were able to celebrate the Good Friday Agreement, David Trimble, his wife and his party had to go and win the hearts and minds of unionism, and that wasn't easy. I think your ankles were kicked about for quite a while over that period as well. Breeze Rogers, obviously, is coming from Dublin today, a native of Donegal. She was a civil rights leader, was a representative in Upper Ban, as the same as David Trimble, SDLP MLA. She was the chair of the SDLP negotiating team, and she was Minister for Agriculture in the first executive. Breeze, it was only 2 weeks ago I realised that I thought you and Barbara de Bruyne were the first women ministers, but there was a woman in the 20s who was a minister in previous executive in Stormont. So you're only the second, unfortunately, Breeze, but still, you made a hell of a difference in terms of foot and mouth as Minister for Agriculture. And then we have Dawn Purvis, who grew up and still lives in Donegal Pass area of Belfast, and her political life started very simply as a mother in a local community set up a mother and toddler group. Probably the proudest thing you ever did, Dawn. And of course, Dawn was part of the negotiating team for the PUP, along with her friend and mentor, the late David Irvine. She became an MLA herself and then took over from David on his pass in 2007. And obviously, after the brutal murder of Bobby Moffat in Belfast in 2010, she stepped down from that role because of the violence of the UVF. And we also have an international guest, Anjali Paran, who's been here all day. She's a Kenyan human rights activist and lawyer. She's currently a visiting clinician at the University of Chicago Law School, where she directs the Global Human Rights Clinic and works along partners to advance justice, address inequalities, structural disparities, and also works on fact-finding investigation and advocacy around the world around human rights. She's an amazing story. She spoke to young people this morning from some of the schools are here, and then there was a workshop with Youth Action NI in Interactive on Pathways to Peace. So she'll give us an international perspective on youth and human rights and peacemaking. Maybe if I could start with you, Daphne, and maybe then Breeze and Dawn first. Maybe if you want to give us your reflections of that period in 1998, and what was the turning point? What made the difference between, because many times in the last week of negotiation, everybody thought things were going to collapse, through to the referendum and the momentous Nobel Peace Prize?
Thank you, Tim, for the invitation to be here. And it's quite emotive for me looking back on those days. And before I go to that final week, I'd just like to say a few words about David and how he came to be the party leader of unionism at that time. Because as David Kerr, in his what I found a very moving speech too, has said, David was an academic lawyer and had been for many years. While he was teaching at Queen's, he was a party activist, though I don't think we used the term activist back in those days. But for many years, he did not expect that he would ever be an elected politician. Because there weren't very many vacancies. And we lived in Lisburn, which was Lagan Valley, Jim Molyneux's constituency, and Jim was not for retiring. So it was chance that, and the sadness of Harold McCusker's death in 1990 that produced the vacancy in Upper Ban. And David had a lot of heart searching to do to know whether it was the right thing for him to do to actually put himself forward at that time, because he was he had a good career and he was going to give all that up to go into the very uncertain realms of politics. I used to tease him that going into politics was his midlife crisis. So he did say that if he went into politics, he was going into politics to do something, and he didn't hang around. There had been attempts at talks before, and David was absolutely certain that he was going in there to do something. He couldn't say at the start what it was going to be. But if we track forward then through the various talks and come through the George Mitchell chaired talks which led to the Good Friday Agreement, it was a very, very difficult time, and there was so much that David felt that as leader of unionism he could not agree to, until it came to the final week when George Mitchell said he was going home at Easter and that was going to be the end of it. And I would like to pay a huge, a lot of tribute to Bertie Ahern, because Bertie came from his mother's funeral to rescue the talks in the last few days. And if he had not done that, there were things that were being put, that were in the documents that were being put forward that David felt he could not agree to, and it really took the two prime ministers, the Taoiseach and I nearly forgot his name there, Tony Blair. So it took them being there and a very, very intense period of negotiation over the last few days. And I wasn't in the room. I was sitting at home, and David would come home to me during that last week with the different iterations that were being put on the table, and we would go through them word by word and see, what does that mean? What is the implication of that sentence? And I don't know whether my views were of any great importance, but it certainly made him feel a little better, I think, to go back in slightly refreshed for the next day after having talked it through with me overnight. I didn't know that there was going to be an agreement on the Friday. I wasn't there. I was listening on the radio for. I used to listen to the news to find out whether David was going to be home for his dinner that night. He wasn't the greatest of communicators. I used to say to him that telepathy is not the most effective means of communicating with me, So yeah, they were difficult days. But I want to make. Sorry, I'm going around all over the place here, but I would like to make the point that doesn't often get made these days, but it was only when Sinn Féin had stopped their violence that David was prepared to talk to them at all, while people were still being bombed and murdered. He was not going to talk to them. So there were various ceasefires, as those of you who are historians will know. I've nearly forgotten when which ceasefire came in which year, and there were ceasefires that were broken and then further ceasefires. But it was only when violence had come to an end that it was possible to sit in the room and talk through things seriously. Now, I think that and I say that because I'm looking at what's happening in the Middle East at the moment, and I just don't know how they're going to come to a solution there. And there was a time when it looked as though the Middle Eastern crisis would be solved long before the Northern Ireland one was.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Breeze, you were in the room, and if I remember rightly, you did give the game away because you, through the windows, you hugged, was it Dennis Howe?
No, it was Seamus Mallon.
Seamus Mallon, hugged Seamus Mallon before the agreement was announced, so people knew there was something happening. So, obviously, your reflections, you were in the room in part of the negotiations, the highs, the lows. What was the turning point that produced the...
To tell you the truth, I don't actually know, Tim, but I just want, if you don't mind, I just want to say something to the young people that are here. And it's this: you look around the world at the moment, and as Daphne said, it's hard to watch the TV and to see what's going on in the Middle East and say to yourself, is there any solution? Can it possibly be resolved? And I just want to say this about John Hume, to the young people here in particular: if you have I hope many young people have great aspirations to save the world. John Hume, when he was 27, a young teacher, he wrote an article in the Irish Times, and I'm going to give you 2 quotes from it. This was now in 1964, when really things hadn't begun to unravel as we saw them. He said, the first thing he said was, a positive step towards easing community tensions would be to recognise that Protestant tradition in the North is as strong and as legitimate as our own. Now, that was kind of sacrilege to Republicans, because they did think that, the Protestants really only thought they were Unionists. They were really, they would come to heel eventually, and that the real majority in Ireland was, the nationalist Republican majority, and that was the gospel at the time. So that was kind of the first time that anyone said, yes, Unionists also have just exactly the same rights as we have to be what they are. And the second thing he said was, which is even more interesting, it's time we stopped playing the patriot game and started to consider what patriotism is all about. In the Ireland of today, true patriotism is that which builds, which sweats, sounds familiar, doesn't it? Which sweats rather than bleeds, and which tries to build up a country which concerns itself with all the problems, social and economic and cultural. Now, if you look at those 2 little excerpts from what he said as a young teacher, that was actually the basis of beginning to solve the Irish problem, which nobody at that time had looked at, because Northern Ireland, you were either nationalist or unionist, depending on your accident of birth or where you came from. And by the way, I should be a unionist because my forebears were Scottish Presbyterians, so as were John Hume's, I believe. However, I think that was, so what I'm saying to young people, he was only 27, he was a young teacher, he wasn't particularly well known, he'd done a lot of work at the credit union and that, and here was this young man putting out these ideas that were new and were kind of radical at that time. Did he ever think then that he would end up bringing those ideas not just to the rest of the nationalist Ireland and unionist Ireland, but to the rest of the world, to the British and to the Americans, and arriving at the Good Friday Agreement? So, things grow from small beginnings, and people who think things through and believe in what they're saying can actually achieve, as John did. And the other thing that he did mention in that was, because at that time the opposition and the nationalist opposition in Stormont had decided to form an opposition and to begin to work with the Unionists, which was new. And the Catholic Church and other nationalists were saying that, they should all get together and work together for the good of the people. And there was no response from the then Unionist politicians. And John did say, if they turn their backs on the present goodwill, there can only be a considerable hardening of Catholic opinion. And I think even if you look around at what's been happening in the last number of years, you can see that happening again. Because what John Hume did do was he gave leadership. He stuck with his ideas about equality and the need to respect the other tradition and all of that. And he kept at it, and he was pilloried. Unionists distrusted him because to them he was just another Irish nationalist who had, the green agenda. And I suppose sometimes some unionists, not all, said he was a fellow traveller of the IRA. And he was pilloried by Republicans for betraying the real republicanism and for actually trying to agree that unionists would have any say in Ireland as such, and partition was wrong and all the rest of it, and he didn't agree with that. So he was pilloried on all sides, and then he was pilloried when he began to speak to Gerry Adams, which he thought was the only way of moving towards peace. He was pilloried, indeed he was pilloried by the southern press, one end of it, one part of it anyway, and pilloried by unionists who accused him and accused me and Craigavon Council of having blood on our hands. So it required tenacity, courage and commitment to really walk the path of politics for 3 decades to get to where he was, despite all the frustrations and the setbacks. And the worst frustration, worst setback I can think of was the Shankill bomb. And even then, Pat, who had stood with him and by him and supported him all the time, had doubts about whether he was right and whether Adams was genuine. And John himself had doubts, I presume, at the time. He must have had doubts. But they carried on, and particularly what happened at the funeral of in Derry, of that awful tragedy in Derry, when the daughter of one of those who were killed came up and said to him, "John, we want you to keep going." And John did keep going, thankfully. And the result of all of his thoughts and and his strategy was, in spite of all that, we got to the Good Friday Agreement. And I also want to say, when I'm at it, I may be going on too long, that David Trimble...
You know the minute.
A few other minutes. David Trimble was... he came from a different tradition of John. The two of them, in fact, represented the 2 different sections of Northern Ireland, if you look at it that way. And Trimble really believed, I think Trimble believed that, I know he believed that the best way to save the Union was partnership and working together and getting normal politics working in Northern Ireland, accepting partnership and all of that. And he had a lot of opposition, and I can just think of the courage of a man who went into talks with Sinn Féin and Gerry Adams at the time when the Republicans had still not given up their guns. So there were, as John used to say, guns on the table or under the table. Wherever they were certainly under the table, but they were still there. And it took immense courage in the face of opposition from the DUP, from some within his own party, I believe, and even from many unionists who were distrustful and didn't really think it was a good thing to do. So, you know, he had all of that. And during the Good Friday Agreement talks, and I know Daphne has referred to it, I think he had the most difficult job of all the leaders there. John had his constituency, his nationalist constituency, supporting him, and he knew that. Now, there were other things he had to do, but David Trimble knew that he had the DUP outside and shouting at him. He had a lot of distrust within the unionist community about, you know, they had been through all these atrocities and all the IRA and all of that, and even some within his own party. And in spite of that, he had the courage, first of all, to realise that the right thing to do was to go with the agreement. And also, I suppose he must have at times thought there was a risk to his own political future and to his party's. But the courage that he showed was tremendous. And actually on that morning, and I know we were all sitting on tenterhooks wondering, would he, wouldn't he? You know, what was going to happen? We knew he was under pressure. When he came and said yes, and I thought, as David said, it was the first time ever that a unionist leader ever said yes to a proposition which was so difficult for many unionists to accept. So really, I think David Trimble and John Hume, more than anyone that I know, deserved the Nobel Peace Prize. And when I look around at what's happening in the world today, I hope that people will look at the Good Friday Agreement and recognise that there's only one way to peace, and that is to talk to your enemies, not your friends. And John, and I know John and David became good friends afterwards, and Daphne and Pat as well. And I know that Daphne and Pat had difficult times, but those two men, more than anyone, and there were many, it's like the GPO, there were many people who really deserved credit, but the greatest credit for the Good Friday Agreement goes to John Hume, who laid the basis, and David Trimble, who had the courage to do the right thing.
Very fair. Don, you obviously were involved in the talks team with David Irvine, so you knew John and David. So maybe give some of your perspectives and what was the dynamic and how did it change in those last 10 days?
I think in the last sort of 10 days there were massive highs and really awful lows. And the emotions that went along with that, the adrenaline went along with that. People were just exhausted. But they knew that to keep their eyes on the bigger prize. And I think people were very hopeful that we could reach agreement. However, it was still elusive. It was still out there somewhere and not within grasp. And there was rumours of Sinn Féin was going to walk, Ulster Unionists were going to walk, Sinn Féin were going to walk, Ulster Unionists were going to, and it was up and down and up and down and up and down. And I remember really some periods of intense negotiations. And I used to take myself off. There was no windows in our offices on the ground floor of Castle Buildings. Some of the parties were lucky enough to have windows. We didn't have any windows. So you felt like you were in a tomb. And I used to take myself off to the coffee lounge on the third floor. And you could look out and you could see all the press, international media, all the press huts and everything else. And it was very, very cold. And I used to take myself up there and hide in a wee corner and watch TV. And there was nobody in. And I remember John Hume coming in. And he just stood there. He was watching the TV. And he knew I was there. He said hello and how are you? How are you getting on? And the next minute, Mark Durkin and Sean Farren come in, and they were very animated and very, what did you do that for, John? John, we didn't agree to that. What did you done this with Trimble? And I was sitting there going, oops, I shouldn't be privy to this conversation, but nonetheless, I'm just gonna sit here and sort of blend into the corner. But it was quite clear that John had done something beyond what his negotiation team had agreed and gone to David Trimble and said yes to whatever it was. I have no idea what it was, but it had caused quite some consternation between Mark and Sean. And I thought, wow, we're getting close here. And similarly, I remember seeing David Trimble in the corridor with David Kerr, and they were about to go back into their party conference room, which was on the ground floor. I didn't think it had windows either. I think it was just a big sort of table where everybody went. And they were having a very short conflab at the door before they were going in. And I could see the pressure. You could see the pressure. You could read the pressure in the body language on the face. And it was nearly like, I take a deep breath before we go in here because this is going to be a pretty rough meeting. So you could read the signs within the negotiations. You could read the signs throughout the building that people were under intense pressure. But I had watched, as Bridge has said and as Daphne has said, I had watched John Hume take risks for peace over the years. I had watched David Trimble take risk after risk after risk. September 97, when Sinn Féin were about to enter the talks and the DUP had walked out along with that great doyen of politics, Bob McCartney. And the Ulster Unionists were, nobody knew whether the Ulster Unionists were going to go into the talks, stay out of the talks. And I remember going to a meeting with David Irvine and Gusty Spence and myself, and it was David Trimble, John Taylor and Ken McGuinness. And we were talking about the necessity for the Ulster Unionists to go back into the talks. And because of the way the elections to the multi-party talks were held, you needed to have what was called sufficiency of consensus within unionism and nationalism in order to get any agreement reached. And David Trimble and the Ulster Unionist Party didn't hold that vote entirely on their own, so they needed, more unionism, more loyalism in there in order to get agreement. And we were saying, this is really important to this country. This is really important for the future of our society, that you take this chance and you go in. And I remember the day that we walked in, and we all walked in together to say, this is another risk. And it's another risk that David Trimble took. walking in to the talks in September 97 with loyalism. Similarly, I remember loyalism throughout that period. There was still murders taking place. Remember, Billy Wright was killed that Christmas in the Maze prison. And loyalist paramilitaries were chomping at the bit to break their ceasefire. And people like David Irvine and Davy Adams were saying, no, absolutely not. No. We have a great opportunity here. You can't. I mean, Sinn Féin, you remember, the IRA were killing people at January 98 under the guise of DAAD, Direct Action Against Drugs. Sinn Féin were expelled from the talks for a while. Then I think it was Red Hand Defenders that had killed some people. UDP were expelled from the talks for a time. And I remember somebody saying to David Irvine, why are you not going mad? Why are you not cracking up the way the DUP are cracking up? Why are you not cracking up and saying things about these murders? And David Irvine said to him, if I get on like Paisley, how do you think the UVF would react? I have to stay calm. I have to stay measured because this process is so important. And so I remember all those people at that time, and David and John, thinking, we've got to get there. We've got to get there. And they did. And they did. But those talks in those last 4 or 5 days were absolutely intense. And if I remember, none of us were of the opinion that we were really going to reach an agreement. And I remember leaving a meeting with Senator Mitchell on the Tuesday and him saying to David Irvine, David, do you think we'll get the agreement? And David said, yes, we will, Senator. And I looked at him and went, where's he getting that from? And Senator Mitchell saying, well, if we do, David, I'll buy you a case of champagne, which he did. But it wasn't until the last 24 hours that I realised just how much John Hume and David Trimble personally had put into that process, and the courage of those two men to get it to come to fruition.
Thank you so much, Dawn. Thank you. Angela, obviously as a human rights activist from Kenya, you've worked in many of the conflict zones. Obviously, Daphne and Fraser spoke to, and I thought Fergal Keane, obviously who's visited many of these places recently, talked about the despair and the need for a community of conscience. We know in this island the rise of xenophobia, attacks on immigrants, the toxicity of social media. It's even greater in other parts of the globe at the moment. So from your experience, do people look at the Good Friday Agreement as something there, or is there some of the principles behind the dialogue and peace and reconciliation that have some meaning in the conflicts you work in?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this tremendous celebration of the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think just from today, there are so many lessons that apply to the rest of the world. So I'm going to summarize a few of them. The first, really, which you spoke about in your kind of opening piece, taking from Pat Hume about the silent peacemakers and what is the role of predominantly young people in pushing for peace and kind of trying to move against the odds. A lot of us today have spoken about young people as the future and the need to safeguard that. I think what a lot of the speeches today have mentioned is the role of young people as the present, and the role of young people kind of in and around and beyond peace negotiations. So to just kind of give an example of what Britt said is, John Hume was thinking about these issues as a young person and was writing about them already as a young person, and kind of had thought about the need to move beyond kind of his own ideas and reach across for difference, as a 28-year-old. And I think that role of young people and young people's kind of opinions and ability to break from the past has been crucial, was crucial to the Good Friday Agreement, but is also crucial to other conflicts around the world. The second is really the role of young people kind of around the table. You heard from David Kerr as a 22-year-old, starting this job. And some of that might have been, the note taker in the room, the person sort of trying to figure out what are the talking points for tomorrow. But those are young people who are maybe not sitting at the table, but are right behind it, taking the notes, preparing, organizing. And some of the conversations that happen amongst young people in the context of peace negotiations are actually vital because they're working across difference. They're working across different factions of societies and communities. And the final thing, which I think was so crucial to the Good Friday Agreement, was having the legitimacy and thinking about the role of it beyond those who are in the actual room and in ensuring that you actually manage to get a referendum and popular mobilization, especially by young people. Because ultimately, while you may have a peace negotiation, it's only as good as how it's going to be upheld. And it's only as good as the young people who will be then responsible for ensuring its implementation. I think the second thing which struck me so much by many of the contributions today is the importance of always talking and always listening. Fergal mentioned this in his speech, that there's so few people who are listening to the other side. And as I think about some of the conflicts that are going on today, that ability to sort of drop one's own ideas and try to think about, okay, what is the shared values that I have with the other side is really what's missing and what's needed. And I think what as has been noted by all of the panelists, was ultimately effective with the Good Friday Agreement, was the ability to say, we're not going to get everything, but where is our shared values and what is our shared hope for the future? And then I think the final thing is looking forward towards the actual implementation and, to what extent has the Good Friday Agreement been a success and what can we learn about it? I think what's been crucial, not just for the Good Friday Agreement, but in other contexts, like, for example, South Africa, that had a peace process a couple of years before that, and is that you have a new generation that's looking at this critically. And in South Africa, what you're seeing is a new generation of individuals who were born free, born after apartheid, who are saying, hold on a minute, while there were many things that were positive about this agreement, there's still so much left to do. And I think there's so much that we can learn about the successes and the future of any peace agreement from those who were born free, those who are assessing it in the future, and the young people who are looking back and saying, here's what was effective and here's what's still remaining to do. And so in terms of thinking about a peace process as more of a two-generation project, there's really a need to sort of almost have a right of review to say, okay, how far have we come and what's still left to proceed in peace agreements to ensure that it's actually durable, that it lives up to those, promises of equality that were maybe enshrined in the agreement but are still needed to push, society forward in a progressive way.
Thank you so much. Dawn?
Yes, I'm going to make a plug for the John and Pat Hume Foundation, because I'm chair of the foundation, very honoured to be chair. We've been running a series of events called the Unfinished Business, which is about the Good Friday Agreement and what we have yet to implement, particularly around peace and reconciliation and the future of it. So on behalf of the Hume Foundation, I just want to thank you all really for coming today. I'd like to thank our funders and supporters. I know that many of them are in the audience, and I'd like to thank Tim for being the host throughout the day. He's put a lot of effort in.
Thank you.
So please do look us up online and look at many of the events that we're running and organising. You're very welcome to participate in them. Thank you.
Thanks, Dawn. The one, I'm only going to ask one more question because it's the role of women, and it's important not to forget one woman who you're very close to, you knew, Daphne, that's Pat Hume. And John, Father Paul Farron at her funeral, Pat Hume's funeral, said, if John was the great peacemaker, Pat brought the pure heart. And she was representative of so many women throughout the peace process. Monica couldn't be here today. You mentioned Mo Mowlam. Mo Mowlam in the corridors of Stormont during the talks had two sayings about John Hume when she met him. One was, yes, da, when John used to preach his single transferable speech. I can't tell you what the second one was, but John didn't mind it. Others did, but he didn't mind. I'll tell you afterwards. But Pat Hume was part and parcel of this peace process. Monica, so many other women, the quiet women peacemakers, and again, obviously, Angela internationally. Maybe just a final word about the role of women, the importance of women, given the panel that we have here today. And what's your last message then to those who are in Stormont today about the need to get back to work?
I think throughout the Troubles, my experience was that it was always women that were like the conscience of the community. Women were always the ones that were to reach out across the political divide. Women's groups, women's organisations, community organisations always managed to bring women together to talk about the common good, what issues were common to them and how we could resolve. And I think an awful lot, I mean, we had the Peace People that was started by 2 women, very much maligned, very much pilloried, but a lot of women have been involved in community dialogue for over the years for a long, long time. So women have always been there. They've always been involved in the peace process, not nearly as visible in the political process. And I think that changed quite a lot in the 90s as we got to see more and more sets of political discussions taking place, and we started to see more and more women elected politicians like Breach and others on the TV. I think it was only when we got our assembly probably before that, when we had the multi-party talks forum, when debates were televised, that the public got to see the misogyny that existed within our political system, and at that time it probably wasn't, people weren't as outraged as they would be now, but it highlighted how difficult it was, I think, for women to become involved in politics and to lead within a political party. But I think there's been trailblazers since then that have been good role models, I think, to inspire a new generation, I think, of women to be involved in politics.
Breeze, I think you want to get in, and then we'll just go along the panel and we'll finish up at that point.
Yeah, I just want to say a few things about women in politics. And I mean, I started when women were kind of an aberration in politics. And the first thing is, I always suffered from imposter syndrome myself, because I didn't ever intend to be a politician. I was involved in civil rights, which a lot of non-political people were, and then I went back to look after my kids and all that. But I did find, when I began to work with organising the party and trying to get people to run for office, every single woman that without exception, that I went to ask would they consider running for the councillors, and the first thing they said is, "Oh, I wouldn't be able for that. Oh, no, I couldn't do that. I've never been involved in anything." One man ever said that to me. One man, and he's dead now, Sean McCavanagh, and he turned out to be one of the best councillors we ever had. So, but it does shows you that women were reticent to be involved in politics, and I think Dawn is right. The more people that see women, like, Mo Mullen was an inspiration, who see women in politics actually, standing up and being able to articulate and do all the things, and to be, as they say, to be good politicians, good spokespeople, it does encourage other young women to come in. And I think as long as there is not an equal amount of women in politics as men, politics will always be lacking in something, because women do have different views of life and different things. But I would just say it used to be extremely difficult. It's not as difficult now, thankfully, and hopefully we will get more and more women in politics.
And Dabney, you had a special reaction with Pat Shane and the Memorial Fund after the Good Friday Agreement. So
I did indeed. At the Oslo events for the presentation of the Nobel Peace Prize, the celebrations lasted for 3 days. And Pat and I got to know each other quite well over those 3 days. There were lots of young Humes and young Trimbles who needed babysitting, and we sort of joined forces in the babysitting tribe. So we decided at Oslo that the two of us would try and do something when we got back home for the victims of the Troubles. And the two of us did work on the Northern Ireland Memorial Fund to give assistance to victims of the Troubles. And I thought, listening to the presentation from St Vincent de Paul earlier, some of the things that you do through St Vincent de Paul are exactly the sort of things that the Memorial Fund did while Pat and I were working with it. It's no longer in existence. became rationalised into the Victims Commissioner. But we did good work at the time, and that was done, the two women working together and keeping ourselves slightly in the background, but doing the groundwork, doing the spade work. And the other thing I would say about women in elected politics is that in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, being an elected politician wasn't a very safe occupation. We certainly, in our party, lost, probably the 40th anniversary of the murder of Edgar Graham is still quite fresh. It was just a couple of days ago that it was 40 years since he was murdered. There was the Reverend Robert Bradford, who was murdered in his constituency office. He was a Westminster MP, and we lost a number of other councillors as well. So it wasn't a safe occupation for women to go down that road. Thankfully, we now have more women members in our party. We're just not getting them elected, but then that's just the way of politics.
Thanks, Rob. And we're going to give the final word to Anthony. Obviously, in the course of the last 2 years, the Foundation have had, on Zoom, talks with Grahamsons and Interpeace with young women UN envoys, one from Libya and one from Somalia, most recently, who were, again, I'm sure it's very masculine, the politics, have set up their own political organisation to ensure not only women, especially young women, get their voice heard in these conflict zones. So maybe you can have the last word about how you inspire women and young people into political action.
Yeah, I think often the stereotype of young men is that, especially in the context of conflict, is that young men are the foot soldiers. They're those who are fighting, and they're seen as a risk. And there's this, especially as you see kind of greater securitization, a perception of young men as being sort of potential fighters, potential terrorists. On the counter side, you see young women as being viewed as in conflict as often as passive victims. And I think you can see this in the context of Israel and Palestine at the moment, that young women are often viewed as sort of helpless or passive. Just as it's not true for young men, it's also not true for young women. And so young women play really indispensable roles in conflict, both positive and not. But I think what has been really crucial has been to harness that potential of young women. I think all of the panelists will explain and can talk in detail about the very fact that women in a negotiating room, in a peace process, changes the nature of that conversation. It might change the nature of the peace process. It might help you to think of areas of concern that others didn't think before. And the same thing applies for young women. In the context of the conflict in Sri Lanka, for the first time, actually, because men were fighting, women were taking up more leadership roles. And so actually at the end of the conflict, there was a big push to say, actually, don't send us back to the kitchen. We have so much more to contribute. And ironically, the conflict had opened up a space of empowerment for women. And so the question becomes, how do you harness that and ensure that there is that space every day? And I think it's by having intergenerational dialogue. I think it's by seeing the tremendous power of young women to peace processes, to improving conflict, and to taking that creativity of young women and sort of seeing the diversity as a crucial part of the kind of work that we do to advance peace and justice.
Thanks, Angela. Can I thank Breeze, Daphne, Angela and Dawn and Bertie Ahern coming in from London. One of the straplines for the Foundation is leadership for peaceful change. Here is an example of 4 very strong, courageous women who can inspire leaders into the future. So thank you very much.